أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Today we will deal with another chapter from René Guénon's The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. Our chapter for today is entitled Time Changed into Space, and this constitutes the 23rd chapter of this work. There is a great deal which is left implicit in this chapter and is not elaborated upon at all, and so it shall be my task in this lecture to shed light on some of the darker corners, so to speak, of the topics alluded to in this chapter. Guénon begins by saying, in an earlier chapter, it was stated that in a certain sense, time consumes space. What was that earlier chapter? That earlier chapter is chapter 21, entitled Cain and Abel, and the passage in question is on page 148, where he states, and I quote, "Moreover, time uses up space, if it may be put so, and correspondingly in the course of the ages the sedentary peoples gradually absorb the nomads," etc. The passage or the phrase in question is time uses up space, and he elaborates on what it means for time to use up space, and in fact for space to in its turn absorb time. He elaborates on all of this in this chapter, chapter 23. So now that we've clarified that, let us read the opening sentence. In an earlier chapter, it was stated that in a certain sense time consumes space, and that it does so in consequence of the power of contraction contained in it, which tends continuously to reduce the spatial expansion to which it is opposed. But time, in its active opposition to the antagonistic principle, unfolds itself with ever-growing speed, for it is far from being homogeneous as people who consider it solely from a quantitative point of view imagine, but on the contrary, it is qualified at every moment in a different way by the cyclical conditions of the manifestation to which it belongs. So the key point in the opening paragraph is that the quantitative view or the quantitative consideration or characterization of time is absolutely mistaken. On the contrary, Guénon says time is qualified at every moment in a different way. Indeed, no two points in time are the same. No two instances or no two events really are the same. Things do not really repeat themselves. I know it is famously observed that history repeats itself, things like this. Statements like this, observations like this are simply not the case. Each duration has its own particular character. It has its own quality. This is the qualitative understanding of time, and it is this qualitative understanding of time that underlies, among other traditional concepts, the traditional and very ancient science of astrology. So each time, each configuration of the stars has a particular significance and a particular deep and qualitative meaning. We also find this in various traditional rites and rituals. For example, in Islam, the prayer times are set. And once you miss a prayer, it is true that it can be expatiated, I think is the word. In other words, it can be made up. But you never really get it back. If the prayer is gone, it is gone. And of course, time in the traditional sense is cyclical. It is not linear. So there are various cycles that repeat, but even within the repetition of those cycles, each particular instant is different from another. It is also said in the Quran, كُلَّ يَوْمٍ هُوَ فِي شَأْنٍ, that every day, so to speak, Allah is involved in some new affair. The Sufis interpret this, the esotericists in Islam interpret this to mean that there is no repetition of theophany, that لا تكرار في التجلي. And this is the traditional understanding then of time. In this regard, there is a very interesting, a very, very, very brief but extremely dense and rich work entitled Mystical Astrology According to Ibn al-Arabi. I can't find my hard copy here, so I'm just going to read from a PDF. And this book was actually written in French by Titus Burckhardt. This is the translation by Bülent Raouf. This is the Fons Vitae edition. It's a very short book. I think it's about 32 pages long. The first time it was translated into English was Beshara Publications, oddly enough, 1977. And the Fons Vitae is from 2001. It has a preface, excuse me, I meant to say a foreword by Keith Critchlow. I have a Keith Critchlow reading list which you can refer to. And he says here, in the context of astrology, and how astrology is really the science of what it means to be human, and in that context, he talks about the qualitative dimension of time. I think this is a very, very profound observation, so I would like to read it in full. He says, and this is on page 5, it's really the first page, but it's numbered 5. What is that favorable moment? This is a direct quote. What is that favorable moment which the Buddha urges us to grasp? Why does he congratulate those who have seized their moment and lament those for whom the moment is past? One is also reminded of the biblical passage about how there is a season for everything. He continues, the explanation lies in the traditional view of time. Illumination, or the goal of human existence, is instantaneous in relation to the long cosmic journey of passing time. It is a comprehension of reality which comes in a flash like lightning. This favorable moment, or paradoxical instant, suspends duration and places the recipient into a timeless present. This timeless present is paradoxical inasmuch as it is qualitatively different from the elusive, profane present that barely exists between two non-entities, the past and the future, and apparently ceases with our death. Neither does the profane experience have any bearing on the prolongation beyond time that the favorable moment brings, which can be likened to a glance outside time. For those of us who have been educated in the values of modern Western industrial culture, the traditional view of time is as difficult to grasp as is its unfoldment represented by the traditional symbolism of astrology, and I'll stop there. So time is not merely a succession of instants. It is not linear. Each time, each instant, each tiny interval has its own character and quality. I think that paragraph from Keith Critchlow really encapsulates very elegantly much of what Genon is trying to say, or alludes to, in some ways he doesn't really spell things out, but alludes, makes little oblique references to. I think that passage from Critchlow very, very elegantly summarizes everything, and I will do my best to elaborate on that as well. All right, so there is a qualitative dimension of time, and many of you will have noticed that there seems to be less and less of it. We never have enough time. We're always very busy. Modern people are always rushing from one thing to another. They cannot slow down. I would say, like in Urdu, we would say and I'll just translate literally, that time today has no real blessed nature to it anymore. It has no barakah in it. It seems, and it's the same with modern money and currency. We talked about this in the chapter on the degeneration of coinage, that there's no barakah in today's earnings. And so this is the situation. You wonder how people like, and this is without going into the realm of people like Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, who have extraordinary support from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are awliya and so forth, but you really wonder how someone let's think of an example. Like Ibn Rushd's grandfather. I mean, how did he write this massive collection of fatwas? How did they write these massive works? These were not things which were done by institutions, or these were done by single authors, like Shihabuddin Qarafi, for example. He has a massive work on Maliki law. How did he do that? There was barakah in their time. One may also argue they didn't have all these silly distractions and so forth. But anyway, I think I've made my point. We don't want to dwell too much on this. Simply that there seems to be less and less time. The acceleration of time, Genon says, is becoming more apparent than ever in our day. This is page 159. Because it becomes exaggerated in the final periods of a cycle, but it nevertheless actually goes on constantly from the beginning of the cycle to the end. It can therefore be said not only that time compresses space, but also that time is itself subject to a progressive contraction, appearing in the proportionate shortening of the 4 yugas, with all that this implies. Not accepting the corresponding diminution in the length of human life, it is sometimes said, doubtless without any understanding of the real reason, that today men live faster than in the past, and this is literally true. The haste with which the moderns characteristically approach everything they do, being ultimately only a consequence of the confused impressions they experience. So Genon is saying that there is a proportionate or a progressive contraction in the length of each of the 4 yugas, in the duration of each yuga, and that is in a proportionate shortening. And this also has its reflection in the shortening of the human lifespan. We find both in the Islamic tradition as well as in the Torah as it survives, in whatever form it survives today, that these very ancient biblical prophets and patriarchs lived extraordinarily long lives. And with the passage of time, with each yuga, the human lifespan has become constricted and shorter and shorter and shorter. Now, this idea about the progressive shortening and proportionate the shortening of the yugas is also an extremely interesting and important point, which Genon does not really elaborate. He's really elaborating to the structure of the cycles. And in this context, there's a very important book by Robert Bolton entitled The Order of the Ages, World History in the Light of a Universal Cosmogony. It is a difficult book, and I also think it's probably a relatively expensive one, but it is worth obtaining and reading. This is the book. The Order of the Ages. I believe it's even gone into a second edition. This is the first edition that I have. I don't know what changes, substantive or otherwise, have been made in the newer edition, but I have the first edition here from 2001. In chapter 16, he talks about the structure of cycles. And he talks about the mathematical structure of cycles. And the fact that, of course, time as a whole is cyclical. And he introduces a very important number, which you need to understand this idea that Gyan speaks of a progressive contraction and the proportionate shortening of the yugas, and that is the number 432,000. There's a lot I could say here, but this number is a kind of universal number. It's a symbolic quantity which we find in many ancient myths and ancient teachings on ancient chronology. It recurs in many different cultures that are completely unconnected in space and in time and place. And it has very profound astronomical ramifications. So, by way of example, on page 211 of this book by Bolton, he says, the writings of the Babylonian historian Berosus contain an account of 10 kings who reigned in succession from the descent of kingship from the courts of heaven to the great flood, a period corresponding to the biblical period from Adam alayhi salam to Noah or Nuh alayhi salam, the so-called age of the patriarchs. He gives the length of each reign, which in each case is a period far in excess of any human lifetime measured in years, and their grand total comes to exactly 432,000 years. This number is also mentioned in the Icelandic Eddas. He gives a citation here from Joseph Campbell's book, The Masks of God, Oriental Mythology, Chapter 3. But suffice it to say that this number, this constant, so to speak, 432,000, is absolutely fundamental. So in the case of the Eddas, the war with the wolf, which is another expression for the epic last battle of the dissolution known as the Ragnarok, when the powers of darkness overwhelm the gods, the number of combatants who are said to emerge here is 540 times 800, which equals 432,000. So this number comes up quite a bit. And in the context of the Kali Yuga, you have to understand that in the traditional chronology of ancient India, there is a period known as the Manvantara. I'm just pronouncing these words the way they're pronounced in American English. I don't want to get into the Sanskrit pronunciation. But the Manvantara, or a world cycle, or an era of Manu, is 4,320,000 years. So this universal era, the Manvantara, is then divided into 4 cycles, or yugas, corresponding to the ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. That would be the Greek idea, but the Indian chronology assigns symbolic periods of time to each of the 4 yugas. So the Krita Yuga is 1,728,000 years long. Now it turns out that the number 1,728,000 is equal to 4 times 432,000 years. The Treta Yuga is 1,296,000 years, which is 3 times 432,000. The Dvapara Yuga is 864,000 years, which is 2 times 432,000, and the Kali Yuga is 432,000, which is 1 times 432,000. So there's a 4, 3, 2, 1. This is the progressive contraction and proportionate shortening of the 4 yugas, which Gyan is alluding to, and he expects you to just know this. So the shortest of the 4 yugas, the Kali Yuga, is thus 1/10 of the total cycle, because it's 432,000, right, years long. And if you actually add up the length of each yuga, which is 1,728,000 plus 1,296,000 plus 864,000 plus 432,000, you get 4,320,000 So I'm sorry, there's a lot of numbers, but it's just addition and subtraction. I'm sorry, I don't have a whiteboard here and I can write all this for you, but if you maybe you want to go back, slow down the video, you can add it up. So the Kali Yuga is 1/10. In other words, it's 432,000 divided by 4,320,000 is equal to 1/10 or 0.1. 1/10 the length of the total cycle. And you will notice that the 4321 follows that of what is known as the Pythagorean tetractys, which is also a 4-3-2-1 relationship, which means it's 4 plus 3, which is 7, plus 2, which is 9, plus 1, which is 10. So this numerical symbolism shows how the first four numbers are in a sense the equivalent of all numbers as they produce the decad, or the decade. So this is the progressive contraction and proportionate shortening of the yugas. Hopefully we are coming to the end of that and the Kali Yuga will be ending soon, but Allah knows best. Continuing on with this idea, if this is carried to its extreme, Genon writes near the bottom of page 159, the extreme limit of contraction of time, or the extreme limit of temporal contraction, then would in the end come down to zero. It would be reduced to a single instant, and duration would then suddenly cease to exist. For it is evident that there can no longer be any succession within the instant. Thus it is that time, the devourer, ends by devouring itself, in such a way that at the end of the world, in other words, at the extreme end of the unfolding, or of the cycle, at the end of cyclical manifestation, there will be no more time. We're running out of time. Time will run out. And as soon as succession has come to an end, or in symbolical terms, he says, the wheel has ceased to turn. This is on page 160. All that exists cannot but be in perfect simultaneity. Succession is thus, as it were, transformed into simultaneity. And this can also be expressed by saying that time has been changed into space. So this chapter really is about the end of a world and what that means. And according to Genon, that, temporally speaking, is a complete and total reversal. A reversal takes place at the last, to the advantage of time and to the disadvantage of time, and to the advantage of space. At the very moment when time seemed on the point of finally devouring space, space in its turn absorbs time, and this, in terms of the cosmological meaning of the biblical symbolism, can be said to be the final revenge of Abel on Cain. If you refer back to that chapter, which is chapter 21. So chapter 21 and 23 are rather complementary. At this point, about the middle of page 160, Genon sees fit to indulge in a rather lengthy and, in my view, somewhat unnecessary excursus on the nature of time in modern theories and its interpretation in such theories as a kind of fourth spatial dimension, or a fourth dimension. So since he has talked about it, I will talk about it. So in the modern theories of relativity of Albert Einstein, the special theory and the general theory, you notice he doesn't mention this here at all, but this is where this is coming from. It's the special theory of relativity as well as the general theory of relativity of Albert Einstein. Einstein developed ideas of many other people. It's not just all his, but that's a matter for the history of physics. Suffice it to say that there is a notion of the contraction or shortening of time, which is found in the special theory of relativity, which states that as you approach closer and closer to the speed of light. Now, in the theory of relativity, it is impossible, it is understood to be a postulate that the speed limit, so to speak, of the universe is the speed of light, or if you prefer, the velocity of light. And that nothing can, in fact, forget about exceeding it, nothing can even get to it. You can only asymptotically approach it. You could get to 0.9999 speed of light, but you couldn't get to the speed of light itself. At any rate, according to this theory, the closer and closer you get to the speed of light, time slows down. And this is where all of these, science fiction movies and like things like a movie, for example, like Interstellar, use this idea that, well, time slows down. And so allegedly, if you actually went to the speed of light, time would completely stop. And this idea is is based on a mathematical relationship, one of three, in fact, known as the Lorentz transformations or the Lorentz transforms. And the Lorentz transform for time states that time t is equal to time t naught times the quantity, the square root of 1 minus v squared over c squared, where v is the velocity that you're going. C is equal to the velocity of light. So if you have v over c, right, and they're both squared, if v is equal to c, then c over c is 1. 1 squared is 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. The square root of 0 is 0. So t, and to multiply that whatever time it is, and that equals 0. And so this square root of 1 minus v squared over c squared is often also called the gamma factor. So as v, that's in modern physics textbooks, as v approaches c, then the gamma factor approaches 0. And you have the same idea for length. So there's it's called time dilation, length contraction, be the exact same equation. In other words, L is equal to L naught times the square root of 1 minus v squared over c squared. And then there's mass also, but in the case of mass is m is equal to m naught divided by the gamma factor, divided by 1 minus v squared over c squared, which means you get infinite mass. So these are all of these theories here, and Genon is basically saying, look, this is a complete waste of time. And in the general theory of relativity, so they will take, they'll have your three variables for position, and the x, y, and z coordinate, and then they'll add a fourth, which is t for time. And some people will interpret this as a fourth dimension perpendicular to the other three dimensions. And this is where you get all this idea about space, time, and curvature, and all of these analogies that they've come up with in general relativity. And basically, Genon is saying that this is not true. He says there is a sort of prefiguration of the absorption of time by space, of which its authors are no doubt quite unconscious in the recent physico-mathematical theories that treat the space-time complex as a single and indivisible whole. These theories, he means special theory of relativity and general theory of relativity, Einstein, incidentally, usually being interpreted inaccurately when they are regarded as treating time as if it were a fourth dimension of space. All right, so much for that. Then on page 161, he says something rather peculiar. He says, in reality, that which plays the part of a fourth coordinate is not time, but something that the mathematicians called imaginal time. And this expression itself, no more than a singularity of language arising from the use of an entirely conventional notation. What he is alluding to here, this conventional notation, is the idea of the square root of -1. So if you take, and we call this I the allegedly imaginary number. So I is defined as the square root of -1, so that I squared equals -1. So if you know about mathematics, so you have this concept of exponentiation. So if you take any number and square it, you just multiply that number by itself. So 5 times 5 is 25, right? And then the square root, the inverse operation of that, will give you the number 5, or it will give you the number of -5, because two negatives multiplied together give a positive. So the square root of 25 is 5, or it's -5. -5 times -5 is also 25. But you cannot take the square root of -1, because no two numbers multiplied together equal -1. Unless you invent that number, and you call it the imaginary number, and you designate it by the letter I, and you say that I times I, or I squared, is equal to -1. Yippee, you've done this. Now, when they developed this idea, so then they introduced the notion of what's called a complex number. And so a complex number has a so-called real part and an imaginary part. So a complex number, Z, or Z, if like the British people say, Z is equal to X plus IY. X and Y are real numbers, and the X is called the real part, and the Y is called the imaginary part. Then they interpret the X and Y as coordinates in a two-dimensional plane. And so the horizontal plane are the real numbers, the X's, and the imaginary axis are the Y's. And in that understanding of things, when you multiply by the number, imaginary number I, that results in a rotation, a 90-degree rotation. It's interpreted as a 90-degree rotation. And so you can give a kind of geometric interpretation to these so-called complex numbers. There were attempts to generalize this to 3 dimensions. It doesn't work. And then they came up with something. There was a guy named Hamilton who came up with something called quaternions, and everybody forgot about them, and they made a great resurgence in modern times because of computer graphics, and this has nothing to do with Ganon. He just brings this up here. He was trained in math. I don't really see what great relevance there is of this being introduced here, other than that, okay, maybe this is some way of talking about a transmutation of time into space. But very few people will even pick up on this. The only reason I did is because my undergraduate degree is in mathematics. Very well then, moving on. The conclusion may be drawn that it is quite useless to look for anything that might be a fourth dimension of space under the conditions of the present world. I agree wholeheartedly. So moving on, about 3/4 of the way down on page 161, he says, all that it is possible to say about this is that when the expansive tendency of space is no longer opposed and restrained by the compressive tendency of time, then space must naturally, in one way or another, undergo a dilation, such as will raise its indefinity to a higher power. So the dilation he's talking about is nothing like that stuff in Einstein's theories of relativity. And he makes this clear. He goes on, he says, after the comma, he says, but it should scarcely, but it should scarcely be necessary to add that this occurrence cannot be represented by any image borrowed from the corporeal domain. So, imaginary numbers, complex numbers, none of that is going to help us here. Indeed, since time is one of the determining conditions of corporeal existence, it is evident that its suppression is by itself sufficient to cause everything to be taken right out of the world. The being is then, in what has been called elsewhere, an extra-corporeal prolongation of the same individual state of existence as that of which the corporeal world represents but a mere modality. This also serves to indicate that the end of the corporeal world is by no means the end of the said state of existence considered in its integrality. So essentially this concept of time change to space is that time continues to get shorter and shorter, there's less and less of it, and just at the instant where it would seem that it's going to go completely to zero, space sort of overwhelms it, and everything is in a weird kind of way reset. That's what the end of a cycle means, because the end of that cycle is really the beginning of a new cycle. So it's the end of the corporeal order or world itself as we know it. And he says on page 162 that in reality, when this happens, in other words, the corporeal world is not annihilated. It doesn't just sort of poof go out of existence when space overwhelms time. In reality, he says, the corporeal world is not annihilated but transmuted, and it immediately receives a new existence because beyond the stopping point, corresponding to the unique instant at which time is no more, the wheel begins to turn again for the accomplishment of another cycle. And so in that sense, the end of a cycle and the beginning of the new cycle is not temporal. He uses the word intemporal. He doesn't say atemporal, he uses intemporal. And I'm not really sure if the two words are completely different. This is just a variation, I'm not really quite sure, but he uses intemporal. And this is, he says, necessarily so because of the strict analogical correspondence existing between the two extreme points. Thus it comes about that the end is in fact the restoration of the primordial state for the humanity of the cycle in question. And then he says some things again about the heavenly Jerusalem and all this, which he's talked about before. So as he comes up on concluding the chapter, he then has a little bit to say about space. And that this time being absorbed by space brings us back to the center. That's why he introduces the idea of the terrestrial paradise and the heavenly Jerusalem. So during the cycle, right, the whole interval, during the entire duration of the cycle, or during the course of the cycle, this center is hidden. And it becomes more and more so with the progressive downward flow of these cycles, because humanity has moved gradually away from the center. And he considers this to be the real meaning of this notion of the fall. The conception of a movement away, says Guénon, from the center is only another way of representing the descending course of the cycle, for the center of a state such as ours, being the point of direct communication with superior states, is at the same time the essential pole of existence for that state. A movement from essence toward substance is thus a movement from the center toward the circumference, from the interior toward the exterior, and also, as is clearly shown in the case, by the geometrical representation from unity towards multiplicity. So, paradise, inasmuch as it is the center of the world, and there's a Sanskrit equivalent, he says, Paradesh, or Paradesha, this is the supreme region. But according to the secondary meaning, a secondary meaning of the same word Paradesha from Sanskrit, it is also the distant region, ever since it has become, in the course of the cyclical expansion or development or downward flow, inaccessible to ordinary humanity. It is, in fact, at least apparently the most distant of all things, being situated at the end of the world, both in the spatial sense and in the temporal sense. Nevertheless, it is always in reality the nearest of all things, since it has never ceased to be at the center of all things. This is page 163. So in the course of the cyclical development, this Paradesha, this center of the world, is no longer accessible to ordinary humanity. And this cessation of time also is a very important point to understand here. The key thing here is ordinary humanity, and I want to just pause on that. So let's say you don't live to the end of the cycle. Let's say you died way before. Does that mean that you are doomed? In other words, doomed to never experience the return to the center, or to experience the escape from history and being drowned, so to speak, in the temporal flow, the river of time, to be drowned in the temporal process? Is there no escape from one's personal history, so to speak, one's historical moment? Is there a door to transcendence? And the answer is there is. He says, ordinary humanity. So if you want to get out of that, you have to undergo some sort of extraordinary, you must resort to some extraordinary measures. And he doesn't really talk about this. And in this context, I think it's very interesting indeed to see what some other authors have had to say along these lines. One of these authors, and probably the most important, at least from my point, in my opinion, the most important scholar to shed light on these metaphysical teachings is Henri Corbin, and I have an Henri Corbin reading list on my channel. You can refer to that. But Corbin was an extraordinary scholar of Islamic esoteric doctrines, and he has a very, very interesting book. And none of his books are really very easy to read, but they are definitely worth the effort. He has a lot of references and so forth. By that I don't mean footnotes. I mean there's a good number of those, but Corbin had this extraordinary ability to recognize similarities among different traditions. I would hesitate to characterize him as a perennialist. in the sense of, let's say, someone like Shuan or Nasr today, and Hussein Nasr is a great admirer of Qurban. So I would hesitate to characterize him as a perennialist in that sense. I don't think, and he does not espouse explicitly anyway and anywhere in his writing some kind of a doctrine of the transcendent unity of religions, of which Shuan has a book of that title, and Genon had some sort of a notion of all of the different traditions somehow are being very complementary to one another and really being expressions and manifestations of the same perennial wisdom, the Sophia Perennis. So it's not really clear to me that Qurban had this same orientation, but he does have, if not a perennialist kind of orientation, maybe what we might characterize more as a universal, maybe as a universalist kind of orientation, if we may term it this way. And with all full transparency, I'm borrowing this turn of phrase. I first heard this from my friend Sayyid Sajjad Rizvi, so I'm acknowledging him here, and I thought it was a very insightful turn of phrase. I don't quite remember where he exactly said this, but anyway, it was, we're always talking, so this was sometime in the last few months. But to get back to my point, so I don't see as he's really a kind of perennialist, but he had this extraordinary ability to recognize certain universal themes, almost like, if we take the idea of, and this is from Qurban himself, a kind of harmony among, in the analogy of music, that you could hear the same thing at, if you hear the same thing played but at a higher octave, let's say, right? So he was able to notice these profound similarities among traditions. And so in The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism, he talks about some notions of sacred space in the opening chapter called Orientation, the pole of orientation and symbols of the North. So he says on the very first page, he says, the pole of orientation. Orientation is a primary phenomenon of our presence in the world. A human presence has the property of spatializing a world around it, and this phenomenon implies a certain relationship of man with the world, his world, this relationship being determined by the very mode of his presence in the world. The four cardinal points, east and west, north and south, are not things encountered by this presence, but directions which express its sense, man's acclimatization to his world, his familiarity with it. To have this sense is to orient oneself in the world. The ideal lines that run from east to west, from north to south, form a system of a priori spatial evidences, without which there would be neither geographic nor anthropological orientation. And indeed, the contrast between Eastern man and Western man, between Nordic man and Southern man, regulate our ideological and characterological classifications. The organization, the plan of this network, has depended since time immemorial on a single point, the point of orientation, the heavenly north, the pole star. It is enough, therefore, to say that spatialization, developed horizontally toward the four cardinal points, is completed by the vertical dimension from beneath to above, from the nadir to the zenith. So there's this concept of a kind of sacred or symbolic north, which is not accessible to our notions of physical geography or cartography. And the entire book then is devoted to this kind of orientation, as he terms it, a kind of method of experiencing and returning to this, what is known as the eighth climate. So in the theories of sacred geography, there were, and even in physical geography, the earth was divided into physical geography into seven climes or zones. They're called in Arabic aqalim, so there's seven iqlims, and in Persian they were known as the seven kishvars. And then there's an eighth climate, which again is not on our physical maps. And the different contemplative methods developed and the different Sufi tariqas and Sufi orders are designed to bring about this experience. And so in another very important book where he deals with this is this book, Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth, from Mazdian Iran to Shiite Iran. And there he talks about these kishvars and how this is an ancient idea in the sacred geography of ancient Zoroastrianism. So he says on page 17 of this work, under the heading The Earth of the Seven Kishvars, the scheme of the surface of the earth as projected here by the active imagination is as follows. In the beginning the earth was established as a continuous whole, but because of oppression by the demonic powers, it was divided into 7 kishvars, the Avestan word being karshvar. I'm not even sure how to pronounce that. This word should be understood as representing something analogous to the Latin orbis. These kishvars are zones of terra firma rather than climates. He goes on, there is a central kishvar, and then this is surrounded, by the 6 other kishvars, and the center is always sort of present, but again, this is not a physical geography. It is a symbolic geography. He says on page 19 in this regard, this method is exactly what allows us to discover an entirely appropriate way of imagining and meditating the earth. In fact, it determines a structure independent of all systems of spatial coordinates. To posit an origin is all it requires. In contemplating this structure, one's attention converges toward the center and is always called back there, since the location, direction, and orientation of the other kishvars are determined by the center and originate from it. The entire structure, therefore, is ordered in respect to this center origin. In whatever place, according to positive geography, we have to situate the primitive history of the Iranians, whether to the eastern Central Asia or to the western Azerbaijan, the mental process of remembering is the same. The events took place and are remembered in Iran Vaj, that's the ancient name, that is at the center, which is at the same time the origin. The presence of the subject at the center is not a situated presence, but a situative presence. In medio mundi, the soul is no longer bound to spatial coordinates. Instead of falling into, of having to be situated in a predetermined space, the soul itself spatializes, is always the origin of the spatial references and determines their structure. This is why we find here not an empirical representation, but an archetypal figure. Now this is all leading up to this notion of an imaginal world, of a realm which is between, so to speak, the physical world and the completely non-physical world, so to speak. And there's an interesting quotation from Shihabuddin Suhrawardi, who died in the year 587, from his Kitabul Mutarahat, I think. Yeah, he calls it the Book of Conversations. And so there's this idea that there's this ancient idea of these realms in the imaginal world of Jabal Qa and Jabal Sa and Hurqalaya and so forth. So he says it from Suhrawardi, when you learn from the writings of the ancient sages that there exists a world possessed of dimensions and extent other than the pleroma of intelligences and the world governed by the souls of the spheres, and that in it there are cities beyond number, among which the Prophet ﷺ himself mentioned, Jabal Qa and Jabal Sa, do not hasten to proclaim it a lie, for there are pilgrims of the spirit who come to see it with their own eyes and in it find their heart's desire. As for the rabble of impostors and false priests, they will deny what you have seen, even if you bring proof to expose their lie. Therefore remain silent and have patience, for if you come eventually to our book of Oriental Theosophy, Kitab Hikmat al-Ishraq in Arabic, no doubt you will understand something of what has just been said, provided your initiator gives you guidance. If not, be a believer in wisdom. This is on page 119 of Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth, and Qurban is quoting from his own edition of Suhrawardi, which we have here. He's quoting from page 109, but it's 109, the footnote. So these are really, both of these works are very much worth looking into if you're interested in this notion. So this idea that the human being can, through certain esoteric methods, certain contemplative disciplines, transcend time and space. And this is seen in, for example, kind of symbolic prophetology, which we find in Alauddin as-Simnani, Ala-Dawla as-Simnani, and Qurban talks about that in his Man of Light in Iranian Sufism. There's this idea that there are prophets, there are the stories of the prophets are historical events, but they also have a wider transhistorical symbolic significance. So in the case of Moses alayhi salam, and he opposes Fir'aun, a particular tyrant in his time, in a particular historical situation and circumstance. And then there is a kind of broader understanding of this, that in every age there is a kind of oppressor, and then he has the person who opposes him, a kind of Moses. Just as in every age there's a kind of a Yazid and there's a kind of a Hussein. We can see this playing out in the world all the time. Similarly, these things take place within the soul as well. These things take place within the soul as well. So there is a tyrant within, which must be subjugated by the Moses of your inner being, or by the Hussein of your inner being, so to speak. Symbolically, we're speaking symbolically here. And that the heart is also like the Kaaba, and the idols in the Kaaba must be destroyed by the coming of the prophet of your inner being, the prophet Muhammad of your inner being, so to speak. So this is all in a realm which is outside of geography, and it's outside of chronology. This is what Genon is alluding to here in this chapter. And so the end of the Kali Yuga, the end of the whole Manvantara, can take place within. There is an involution. You can bring this about in your very self, in your very soul. And of course, that must also happen in the corporeal world itself, in the world of mundane history, as the cycle winds down. And this entire cycle comes to its end. As Genon says here at the end, he says, release from the temporal condition is always possible for certain beings in particular, but as far as humanity, or more exactly, a humanity, taken in its entirety, not extraordinary or exceptional individuals, in its entirety is concerned, a release from time obviously implies that the said humanity has passed completely through the cycle of its corporeal manifestation. Only then can it, together with the whole of the terrestrial environment that depends on it and participates in the same cyclic movement, be really reintegrated into the primordial state, or what is the same thing, into the center of the world. And it is there, in that very center, that Genon tells us that on page 164, that time is changed into space, because it is where the direct reflection in our state of existence of the principial eternity is found, and thereby all succession is excluded. Moreover, death cannot attain thereto, so that it is also the very seat of immortality. All things appear therein in perfect simultaneity, in a changeless present, through the power of the third eye with which man has recovered the sense of eternity. I hope that this inspires people to look further into these matters, and I pray that the third eye of all of us be opened. Thank you very much for watching.